Hey, welcome back. It's been a while since I've posted anything, so I thought let's go ahead and jump in with everyone's favorite conversation topic, privilege. So the notion of privilege is a big topic, and I don't have time to go into the ins and outs of what it actually is in this moment. But suffice it to say, there is a concept that societally some groups start out with somewhat of an advantage in terms of achieving some levels of success. Now, importantly, privilege is often misconstrued to mean that some groups are given free opportunities to be successful. That's not what it means. It just means that some groups, by virtue of the way society is set up in various forms through lots of complicated interactions, it can be just a little bit easier to achieve success in some cases or the other. But it's not saying that success is possible without hard work. Regardless of what privilege is or isn't, what we know from psychological science is that presenting people with the notion of privilege can result in some reliably defensive reactions, and they stem from two ways that privilege can be interpreted. On the one hand, privilege can seem to threaten a sense of a meritocracy. We often like to think that our successes are based exclusively on the work that we put in, and that anyone who puts in work can achieve success. Now, privilege is not meant to deny that hard work is important. Instead, it just means that hard work tends to be harder in some cases over others. But when presented with the notion that there is privilege in the world, people seem to take it personally and react as though it's their own hard work that's under fire. The other thing the notion of privilege can do is threaten a sense of group identity. So if privilege acts to undermine the rosy picture one has of some group to which they belong, whether it be a racial group, a gender group, whatever, it can feel threatening in that way because we derive a lot of our sense of self-worth from how well our groups are doing. I want to talk about two studies that highlight what these kinds of threats can result in. The first stems from this meritocratic threat, this idea that when people hear about privilege, it can seem as though it's an attack on their own effort that they've put into achieving their personal amount of success. Some researchers had white participants randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they didn't really do anything special, but in the other condition, they had participants read a short blurb that simply mentioned the presence of white privilege, that simply talked about privilege and what it might mean and how it may result in some disparities in achievement. After everybody either read that blurb or went through some introductory remarks, they had participants respond to some questionnaire items asking, on the one hand, how much they believe in white privilege, and on the other hand, how much they've experienced personal hardship in their own lives. What they found is that compared to the control group, white participants who had been exposed to a brief message about white privilege reported more hardships in their own lives. In other words, even though they were randomly assigned, right, by random chance, this group did not actually necessarily experience more hardship than the others, but they were motivated to report having more personal hardships in their history. Now, the interesting thing is that this group was not any less likely to believe in privilege. They believed in privilege just as much as the control group, but instead there seemed to be this reaction where they wanted to justify their own achievement by drawing on their own personal struggles as if that were supposed to undermine the notion of privilege at all. In a follow-up study, they took the same kinds of participants, but before they had them read about privilege, they just put them through a short little exercise to remind them that they are good people and committed to good values. When people went through this brief exercise to reassure them that they were okay people, suddenly the threat of privilege was rendered ineffective. So we've seen that one thing that can happen when people confront a notion of privilege is that they deny that they themselves have benefited from any sort of privileged status by reinforcing the struggles that they've had in their lives. But another thing that can happen comes from the other kind of threat that privilege can pose to a person, which is if people feel as though, if they interpret the notion of privilege to mean that their group is not so great, One defensive reaction is to distance oneself from that identity. So if a person is white and is confronted with the notion that there may be some white privilege in the world, a person's response may be to actually distance themselves from the idea of whiteness, to sort of say that me and whiteness are not so tightly linked. One study showed this pretty simply in that they had white participants expect to interact with either a white or a black partner talking about either neutral or race-related issues. What they find is that in the condition where white participants expect to have a conversation about race-related issues with an African American conversation partner, they are less likely to automatically associate themselves with whiteness. But it's not that people don't ever associate themselves with whiteness. In other conditions, they are connecting a sense of themselves to a white race identity. It's in these conditions where there may be some threat to an idea of the status of one's group that people pull away from a sense of white identity. Now, researchers who talk about reactions to privilege don't just leave it at that, right? On the one hand, they can deny that privilege has happened to them or has benefited them. They can distance themselves from a notion that they belong to a group that has historically received some privilege. But the other thing that can happen, according to theorists, is dismantling. So deny, distance, dismantling. And that's the notion of grappling with privilege and seeking an opportunity to overcome it, to turn it off, to create a more equitable force in society that doesn't necessarily privilege some identities over another. The question, of course, is when is it that that is going to happen over the others? If people are denying or distancing, then dismantling doesn't seem as likely to happen. But if a person can reach that point, the question is, what happens now, right? How do we talk about privilege in a way that both is consistent with the evidence that's out there about group-related disparities, but also is easing the concerns that people might have about what it means for who they are and how much work they've put into achieving their own success? But those are questions for another time. For now, though, we've at least covered the three main defensive reactions people can have when confronting a notion that their group might be privileged, according to plenty of research in psychological science. Well, next time maybe we'll talk about some things that are a little less socially controversial than privilege, but I do think this research is important, and hopefully this has been illuminating to at least a handful of viewers. See you next time. For more social psychology, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or go to beapeopleexpert.com and find new articles every week about psychological science.